book I'm going to be talking about today discusses whether someone can be manipulated into being a good person after committing some of the worst crimes imaginable. It discusses the ethics of free will, the link between fine arts and violence, and the nature of redemption through both a religious and humanitarian lens. Hey everyone, welcome back to the series where I read books on the Disturbing Iceberg book chart and I rate them so that you don't have to. I'm going to be breaking down the book based on how disturbing it was and rate it both on how disturbing and how good it was and describe everything that happened so that if you don't want to read it, you don't have to. With that in mind, there will be massive spoilers for the book, so if you want to just see my rating with no explanation or spoilers, it'll be in the description below. Let's get into the second book on the list, A Clockwork Orange. Also, we're having a heat wave in the UK right now, so if you could just ignore how frizzy my hair is, that would be great. Thanks, bye. Tier 1. A Clockwork Orange. Like the last video, The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, most people know this based off of Stanley Kubrick's classic movie adaptation of the book. In fact, most people I talked to about the movie didn't even know it was based on a book. I always try and rate a book objectively without thinking of the adaptations, but as with the last video, I will reference some differences between the book and the movie for those of you who are curious, because I know that it's a lot easier to just watch a movie for those of you who are interested than it is to read a book a lot of the time. The movie is actually one of my favourite movies of all time. The music, cinematography, set design and acting make it very unique. So I was curious to see what the book would be like for me, since most of the elements I love from the movie wouldn't even be in a book. It can't translate into a book, you know? When researching the book a bit before I read it, I found out that the author of the book, Anthony Burgess, had a bit of a complicated relationship with the movie. The book was sort of autobiographical, not in the most literal sense. Burgess wasn't doing all the crazy things that happened in the book. However, he did say that he used his time writing the book to address the main social issue he was passionate about: freedom of choice, and to process some of his life experiences and purge them, to catharticize the pain, the anguish in a work of art. As Oscar Wilde famously says in The Picture of Dorian Gray, every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. In other words, this book was extremely important to Burgess, more so than some of his other books, and yet when it was released in 1962 it sold extremely poorly. It was praised by readers, but it was kind of overlooked by most of the public. Someone who did love it though was Stanley Kubrick. The film adaptation released by Kubrick in 1971 gained notoriety. It caused a massive uproar with the public, and at the time everyone thought it was too violent. And you know, it's funny because a lot of the stuff that causes an uproar seems to end up being classics, and that's one of the things that happened to this film. It is kind of one of those movies that everyone says you have to see it once. At first, Burgess loved the film, but as time went on, people sought to only really ask him about the film. Not even the book, not even hey, what do you think of the adaptation in terms of how different it is from the book? It was literally just, hey, why did you do this in the movie? They kind of ignored his other works, and he just grew tired of hearing about it. It's also rumoured that his relationship with Kubrick was strained during the time, which didn't help tensions, but that's not necessarily confirmed. The reason I bring this all up is because the book has quite a few key differences to the movie, and it's been a topic of critics for years which one is better, mainly in regards to the ending, which is dramatically different. If you haven't seen the movie, I recommend watching it before watching this review, as I'm going to be discussing the events of the book and the movie to compare them a bit, and like I said, spoilers, it's a great movie, go watch it. So the book is split into 3 parts. Part 1. The book begins by introducing us to Alex, the main character, and his gang of friends, or as he calls them, droogs, Dim, Georgie and P. As annoying as it is to go on another tangent before I explain the plot, I have to address the language used in the book. The book uses a fictional slang called nadsat. Nadsat is used all throughout, which can be kind of a deal breaker for some readers. Nadsat, while fictional, is based off a sort of Russian-influenced Cockney English. It's not a full-on language, the book is still written in English. However, some words are replaced and some are written with an accent that some people might find difficult to follow. So for example, Alex says, "We sat at the curve of a milk bar, making up our razadocs what to do with the evening. A flip dark chill winter bastard through dry." Which basically just means it was cold and they were trying to decide what to do that night. And that was one of the more basic examples. Some people understandably can't read the book because of this. You basically need to remember a whole dictionary full of words. Some examples include a Chelovek equals a person or fellow man, a Droog equals a friend, a full drum is a cinema, and so on. If I had to guess, I'd say about a quarter of the book is just pure Nadsat. Personally, after reading a whole lot of old English texts and like really old classics, you kind of just get used to filling in certain words through the context. So I found it fairly easy to read and kind of navigate through. There's also Nadsat dictionaries online if you prefer to read it that way. Some people prefer to literally sit with the dictionary and go through each word. But like I said, for me, I didn't find it that bad. However, that's a hassle. Like, not a lot of people would deal with that, which is completely fair. That's not any judgment from me. I get that this is difficult for a lot of people. Now that I've explained all that, and you know that I'm not having a stroke when I'm saying half the stuff in the video, I can finally talk about the plot. Alex is the leader of his band of droogs, and it's clear right off the bat that he kind of feels a sense of superiority above them. Dim is exactly what he sounds like, but what he lacks in intelligence he makes up for in brawn. Georgie, who is second in command and a bit more outspoken against Alex at times. And lastly, Pete, who's very quiet and he kind of just gives this air of indifference to the violence that the gang gets up to. Alex himself is an interesting character. He has an obsession with violence, which he refers to as ultra-violence. But despite seeming like a stereotypical thug at first, he's very intelligent and can even be charming when he wants to be. The only thing that matches his fascination with violence is classical music, specifically Beethoven or lovely Ludwig van, as he calls him. He's obviously the most important character, as this book, I would argue, as much as being like a kind of allegory, is very much a character study more than anything. So they all sit in a milk bar, which sounds innocent enough until you realise the milk is laced with drugs, and as mentioned, they contemplate what to do with the evening. They decide to partake in some ultra-violence and go on a crime spree, doing all sorts of illicit activities like assault, car theft, robbery. They even get in a gang fight with another gang before running off when it seems like the police are nearby. The worst of these crimes being when Alex and his gang break into a writer's home wearing masks, assault him, and make him watch as they gang rape his wife. This is described quite viscerally, however, the Nadsat can make it a little bit difficult to fully interact with the horror of the scene, in my opinion. The writer is working on a book called A Clockwork Orange, which just brings the meta-ness completely into the novel, which brings us to the whole other point. This scene mirrors Burgess's own experiences when his wife was assaulted during World War II. The scene therefore offers us some insight into Burgess's reasoning for writing the novel. On a larger scale, he's seen a lot of terrible things that could in one way or another be linked to a larger social issue, leading to his passion when discussing the philosophy of said social issues, which is, as mentioned earlier, his reason for writing the novel in the first place. They go back to the bar after this, where Dim insults an opera that Alex is fond of. Alex gets especially defensive of classical music, and often gets frustrated when the others in his gang act in a way that's unrefined. So publicly mocking an opera is taken as like a personal offence to Alex. Alex does have sort of a moral code. It's more like an etiquette code. He believes in using charm to win people over and expects his droogs to do the same. His friends, however, while not necessarily dumb, well, maybe except Dim, are either too quiet or just uninterested in partaking in that type of manipulation, causing Alex to feel that he's the rightful leader since only he is intelligent enough to appreciate the finer things in life. Alex gets so angry with Dim that he just punches him in the face. The rest of the gang usually tolerate how arrogant Alex can be, but they're visually too intimidated by him not to most of the time. This is a step too far even for them, and they get into like a huge argument. Dim, Georgie and Pete make it clear, especially Georgie, that they think he went too far, but Alex feels still justified in his actions as he sees it as just a necessary punishment for Dim's vulgarity. The gang reluctantly decide to leave the subject to go home, and the next couple of chapters gives us an insight into Alex's home life. He himself is only 15, so he lives with his mother and father, who are just as scared of him as his friends are. He decides the next day he doesn't want to go to school, and while his parents don't necessarily believe his excuse of a headache, they don't seem to think it's worth fighting him over, so they just leave him in bed. Throughout the novel, Alex has some disturbing dreams which give us a look into his twisted psyche. He has dreams where Dim is being ordered to whip him by Georgie. The dreams are used as a device to show what Alex is comfortable with at any given time in the novel. At the start, he often dreams of violence, and this changes later in the novel and changes again near the end. Alex wakes up and realises the doorbell is ringing. When he answers it, he sees his post-corrective advisor, PR Deltoid. Deltoid seems about at his wit's end with Alex and warns him about missing too much school and causing trouble. The conversation is tense as Alex tries to deny everything and charm his way out of trouble. Deltoid obviously doesn't believe him and wonders what about him could be causing him to act this way. He brings up his loving parents, his stable environment, and wonders what reason there is for Alex to be such a troublemaker. He also warns Alex that he's overdue for getting in trouble with the police, and we get the impression that one more crime from Alex would result in a complete lapse in the leniencies previously been given. Deltoid gives us our first insight into sort of a running theme with the novel, which is the contemplation of evil. The adults in the novel are very nuanced or likely to ask Alex's opinion or thoughts on the matter. They kind of just ponder his reasons for crime right in front of them in a sort of detached way, often calling back to a lot of physical or statistical factors such as parents or physical health. The only time that an adult in the novel takes a more abstract approach to the issue of how evil blooms is when referring to religion. Deltoid himself even asks Alex if he has like a devil inside him. Once he leaves, Alex contemplates what life would be like in prison. He doesn't seem that worried about it. He just kind of thinks it'd be a minor inconvenience before he just goes back to his life of crime. We then get an interesting analysis of crime and the nature of good and evil from Alex's perspective when he reads an article on the youth of today. In a nutshell, he wonders why good seems to be the natural default for people, and evil thoughts and activities seem to be the abnormal thing that scientists research and look into. Why isn't it the other way around? Why isn't good deeds researched the way that evil deeds are? He believes that evil is a natural way of being, and institutions that look to stop that way of living feed into the need to do evil. The idea of rebelling is so attractive to him that sometimes he acts on impulse to rebel over the impulse to be violent. Perhaps if institutions were outlawing doing good deeds, he'd be a better person. And it just kind of gives the impression that the idea of rebelling is more important to him than what he's actually doing. He reads in an article that crime is being linked to a lack of appreciation for fine arts from the youth. This is ironic, of course, as he himself enjoys classical music and other manners of fine art that adults seem to think leads to law-abiding teenagers. I'm sure we've all had that grouchy uncle talk about how kids nowadays are violent due to rap music or video games, and this kind of seems to be a commentary from Burgess on that sort of mindset. He makes it clear that one can enjoy sophisticated things while still being completely morally void. Alex then goes to a record shop and meets two 11-year-old girls there. You may be familiar with this scene in the movie where he takes home two women and has relations with them. I was shocked reading the book to see that the girls are 11. He sees himself as above them as they try too hard to be seen as like adult. He takes them home, gets them drunk, and rapes them both. He himself is underage, he's only 15, but that doesn't make it any better. In the movie, the sex is consensual, and it happens when they're all around 17. So seeing this from the book was shocking. In my opinion, it's the most disturbing part of the whole novel. But even then, I have to say it's not that evocative. The language is a little bit of a barrier for the horror to truly come out. Here's a quote from the book describing the scene. I have my trusty copy here. This time they thought nothing fun and stopped creaking with high mirth and had to submit to the strange and weird desires of Alexander the Large, which, what with the ninth and the hypojab, were Chudisny and Zamashat and very demanding, oh my brothers. But they were both very, very drunken and could hardly feel very much. It's honestly a little bit hard to take the whole thing seriously when it's described like that. And as I'll get into later, the language, while very creatively used, can be a barrier for how disturbing the novel is. I really don't want to make it seem like I'm making fun of like a serious issue here. So the best way I can describe it is this. A man walking down the street is attacked by someone, which is at its core a terrible thing to happen. Your sympathy and impression of the situation, though, will change depend on how it's described to you. If someone describes to you the despair of the man, the impact every blow had on him, the sounds he made as he crumpled to the ground, it sets up a terrible and disturbing image. But if someone tells you the man was walking and got bonked on the noggin a few times, despite the attack still being terrible, you can't help but think of a little cartoon guy getting hit by a toy mallet. The language used in the novel dictates its emotional impact on the reader, despite how serious the issue at its core may be. Like I said last video, this isn't necessarily a criticism of the book in general. It wasn't necessarily written to deeply disturb people. However, of the context of this being put on the Iceberg chart, which is about disturbing books, and this video being part of that series, I have to make it clear that the language really doesn't translate how horrific the acts are in the book. They wake up terrified and leave, and Alex is happy to have taken them down a peg or two in his mind. That night, he goes downstairs to the gang waiting for him, and they stage a sort of intervention where they tell him that they want a more democratic approach to the gang. They set down some ground rules such as no picking on Dim, fair pay cuts, and more sophisticated and high caliber crimes. Alex agrees but is inwardly angry and vows to put them back in their place. When walking outside, he hears Beethoven coming from a nearby radio, giving him a rush of adrenaline. He threatens Georgie and ends up in a knife duel with him. He ends up slashing Georgie and Dim in the duel and leaves her the milk bar, happy that he's regained his authority. Dim and Georgie are much more quiet after this, however, Georgie does suggest that they rob a house called the Man's. The robbery does not go well. It's an elderly woman, which is quite different from the yoga instructor in the movie, who lives there, and when they scout the house, Alex decides to get cocky and show off how much better he is than the rest of the gang by robbing her himself. He breaks and beats her with a bust of Beethoven, which, if you've seen the movie, is quite different from what he beats her with in the movie. He hears sirens coming and runs to escape the house, where he sees that his gang have ran off, all except Dim, who waits for Alex to come outside and catches him off guard. Dim knocks Alex to the ground and runs away, leaving Alex to get caught by the police. The police are ecstatic to finally have a concrete reason to put Alex away, and they beat him and drag him into a police car while Alex is left reeling from the betrayal of his friends. At the station, he is roughly interrogated and beaten by the police. Deltoid comes into the station and seems frustrated but expectant that Alex is there. He spits in Alex's face and leaves him. Alex eventually tells all to the police and tries to make sure his drugs are also just as incriminated as he is. The police don't seem to care less about his friends now, because they've caught the leader of the gang. He is taken to a cell and falls asleep. That night he dreams of Beethoven's Ninth, except the lyrics are detailing Alex paying for his sins. The next morning he's awoken by an officer and told that the woman he beat last night has died in hospital, and he's now looking at a murder charge. Part 2. Part 2 takes place 2 years later when Alex is 17 and still in prison and is working with the prison chaplain. He's been given a 14-year sentence and has been using the last couple of years to suck up a bit to the chaplain by snitching on fellow prisoners and feigning interest in the Bible. Some of the snitching Alex does is true enough, though others are made up in order to get good favour with the governor to reduce his sentence. Alex asks the chaplain about a new experimental technique that he's heard gets people out of prison faster, the Ludovico's technique. Sorry if I butchered that. The idea of the experiment is to program goodness into a person through some classical conditioning. Alex is very eager to take part in order to get out of prison faster, but the chaplain expresses worry that scientists are trying to synthesize goodness when it should come from within. That evening, Alex gets into a fight with a new prisoner, resulting in the prisoner's death. This fight is the catalyst for Alex's redemption, as he's chosen as the ideal subject for the experiment due to his increasingly violent tendencies. He also has a dream after the fight where someone plays a phallic-looking instrument and scolds Alex for laughing at him. Unlike some of the other dreams, I don't know what I was trying to say. No. Alex goes to the governor's office to discuss the treatment. We don't yet find out what the treatment involves, but the governor kind of talks of the treatment in a way that makes it seem as though the treatment doesn't really cause you to want to be good. It just seems to kind of take away the ability to be evil. Both the chaplain and the governor seem dubious of the treatment, but nevertheless, Alex signs a form agreeing to take part in the procedure called the reclamation treatment. The treatment will take place over the course of 2 weeks. after which time Alex is going to be completely released. This sounds like Christmas come early to Alex. He seems not even to consider the possibility that the technique might work. His focus is purely on getting out as soon as possible so he can just live a life of crime again. He discusses this with the chaplain, who ponders on how ethical the treatment is. Is goodness really good if not chosen? A point I'll discuss later. He of course narrows in on the religious aspect. Is it right for man to interfere with the way God intended someone to be, even if they are evil? The chaplain seems to be the only one who really delves into the less statistical reasons for crime and really looks at the individual. However, he only really does so from a religious point of view, and he once again doesn't ask Alex. Being 19 myself, I found it interesting and unfortunately accurate how adults in the novel seem to love contemplating Alex's nature and way of being without even taking any time to consult him. We know that Alex already has thoughts on this that he would possibly be willing to share, but no one asks. They talk about it as if he's even there. I'm not saying I've committed any crimes, but I've certainly been in the room when teachers or parents kind of discuss why I am the way I am without even asking me, and I'm sure other people have had that experience as well. I find it fascinating that Burgess seems to satirise the way that adults talk down to and treat children, even older ones, teenagers, despite the fact that he himself was 45 when writing the novel. The doctor tells Alex that he'll be watching some movies and getting injections, but does not elaborate any further. This causes Alex to be even more smug as he's like, well, what harm could a few movies do? Alex immediately fantasizes about his life getting out of the prison and plans on getting some new drugs to enact revenge on Jim, Georgie and Pete, and kind of contemplates how to partake in more crime without getting caught this time. That night he's given his first injection and taken to a cinema room with the multiple researchers, including Dr. Brodsky himself. He is strapped into a chair in the middle of the room, restrained so that he cannot turn his head or close his eyes, and fitted with a wired cap. The movies begin to play, and the first one involves a man being beaten viciously. This doesn't bother Alex until he suddenly starts feeling rather nauseous. The second shows a woman being raped, and every film after that is just exceedingly violent and meaningless. Alex feels extremely sick and wants to vomit. He pleads for the movies to end, but is told that this is just the beginning by Dr. Brodsky. By the end of the day, he is taken to his room and given a cup of tea, still physically sickened by the films he had to witness, and is visited by Dr. Bronham, who explains that the procedure is designed to make his body repulsed by the thought or sight of violence. He is assigned a discharge officer whose job is to get him on his feet after prison. The officer asks Alex to punch him to see if the procedure is working, and after some goading, Alex does and misses, noting that even just taking a swing causes him to feel extremely ill. That night he dreams of attempting to rape a girl and feeling sick. The dream disgusts him and he wakes up feeling really nauseous again, and the dream is once again used as a device to show how comfortable he is with violence, and he's not very comfortable now. I just realised that I kept my wardrobe open when I went to go get the book, so I'm gonna ignore that happened. Nothing happened. You didn't see anything. In case it isn't clear what the experiment is done with, it's done through giving him an injection to make Alex feel ill, then showing his violence after the injection in order to condition his body to react to violence with repulsion. The experiment is dealing with a very psychological problem in a much more biological way. By making his body react to violence, they technically stop him from committing the crimes, but he doesn't necessarily become a good person. He's not adverse to crime internally. His reasons for not committing crime, if this works, will be purely selfish. It makes him feel sick, so he's gonna stop. He's not gonna care about the other party or want to stop because it's morally wrong. He's gonna do it because it makes him feel better. As the experiment goes on, Alex is injected and forced to watch the films. One day he watches a film about Nazi war crimes and Beethoven's Fifth is in the background. Alex is enraged and sickened by this and throws up. Due to this, he's accidentally conditioned to be repulsed by the music he loves so much, the one part of his life that he enjoyed that was not based upon crime. The doctors simply see this as just punishment for his crimes and move on. Later in the experiment, he expects his daily injection but is not given it and is asked to go to the screening room on his own accord. He does and is surprised that without the injection, his reaction is just as unpleasant now. He's been thoroughly conditioned. He's completely distressed when he realises that the procedure is working and he plans to escape that night. He plans to call the orderly that night and attack him, which, I mean, I don't know how he thought that was going to work. As expected, he can't bring himself to hurt him because it makes him feel sick. It's almost as if he just discovered that the conditioning is working. The orderly punches him for even attempting to attack him and leaves the room. He goes to sleep but feels tortured by the realisation that he would rather be punched than be the one doing the punching now. The day finally comes for Alex to be released. He simply has to be part of a demonstration showing the success of the experiment before he can be released. Dr. Brodsky gathers a crowd of reporters and the chaplain, the governor, and other researchers to the screening room, where there is now a stage for Alex. The demonstration begins with a man coming up to Alex, insulting him and hitting him. Alex can only take the beating as the thought of fighting back makes him too ill. He's eventually forced to lick the man's boot in order to get him to stop. The doctor takes to the stage to explain Alex's conditioning and asks if there's any questions from the audience. This begins a debate amongst the audience, who seem rather split on the morality of the subject. The chaplain argues against treatment, stating that forcing a person to be good does not make them so, and that it's an act against God. The researchers take the stance that results and lowering crime rates are what's important. They're not too concerned with the morality of it. A debate also breaks out about the ethics of involving Alex in all of this. Even though he agreed to the experiment, he wasn't given full disclosure or the ability to withdraw in the middle of it. The debate comes as Alex himself exclaims his protest and asks if anyone cares what he thinks. Just like every other time his nature has been discussed, he is ignored and just seen as the convict that agreed to be experimented on. As the audience continue to argue, the word love comes up. When he hears the topic of love, Brodsky invites a near-naked woman up to the stage, which causes Alex to feel sick just at the mere thought of lust. Instead of sexualizing her as he usually would, he pledges himself to protect her despite feeling ridiculous while doing so. He notices that the other members of the audience look at her lustfully despite supposedly being the good members of society. The very fact that they bring out a naked woman as a piece of meat to dangle experimentally above the monster shows the hypocrisy of expecting Alex to refrain from disrespectfully lusting after women. Part 2 ends with Brodsky claiming that Alex is now a good Christian. Good Christian is a great analogy for the situation, as Alex will no longer sin for his own good. Christian's goodness and kindness may be transactional as a means in order to benefit the self as they get into the eternal paradise waiting for them, heaven, should they follow that path. Just as Alex's goodness and kindness is a transactional means in order not to feel ill. That's not necessarily my view on Christianity, by the way, no offense intended. That's simply my understanding and analysis of why that word choice was used. Please don't kill me. Part 3. Alex is finally released from prison after the demonstration with his clothes and some pocket money to his name. He sees an article in the newspaper about the experiment that claims that he has been cured by the Ludovico's technique. This angers him and he sets off home to see his mum and dad. When he gets to his parents' apartment, he is amazed by how cleaned up it looks and is expecting a warm welcome and the comfort of his room. He is surprised to find out that his stuff is seized by the police and his room is being rented by a young man, Joe, who is like a son to his parents. His parents seem still scared of Alex but try to put on a warm facade, though they ultimately tell him that they will not throw Joe out and Alex will have to find somewhere else to live. Alex leaves angry and hurt, disturbed that the two people whose love he feels he has the right to has turned on him. Alex tries to take comfort in his beloved classical music, but is sickened as he remembers he's now conditioned to feel ill while listening to it. He goes back to the milk bar and, while under the influence, has a vivid hallucination of rising from the earth into the hands of God when everything all of a sudden turns cold. The angels disapprove of him and he's flung back down to earth. The hallucination awakes suicidal feelings in Alex and he looks to the local library for help. When in the library, he finds a Bible and is distraught that even the violence described in the Bible is enough to make him feel ill. A man soon comes over to comfort him, but they're shushed by another old man, who Alex soon recognises as the man he and his drugs beat up years ago. Him and the other library patrons attack Alex violently, and any retaliation will obviously make him sick, so he has no choice but to take the attack and beg for someone to call the police. The police do eventually arrive, but Alex is horrified to recognise the two officers as Dim and Billy Boy. Billy Boy was the leader of the gang who he previously fought. They scare off the librarians, but when they realise who Alex is, they torment him and fling him into the police car. They take him to a remote location where they beat him thoroughly, and it is implied that they rape him. With this, Alex has reached rock bottom, and almost every misfortune he's caused on others has come back to him full circle. They eventually leave, and a weak Alex wanders the countryside looking for help. He comes across the same cottage that he'd broken into years ago, the cottage of the writer and his wife, who Alex raped. He knocks on the door and sees the writer still lives there, and his wife is nowhere to be seen. Alex is helped in by the man, and his wounds are tended to, as the man does not recognise him as he wore a mask that night. The man lets Alex bathe and gives him fresh clothes before sitting down to have dinner with him. The man tells Alex he read the newspaper and knows of the treatment he went through. Alex relays his story and tries to garner pity from the old man, as he describes how his love for music was taken away from him. The old man does feel sympathy for Alex and expresses worry at the lack of ethics shown when taking Alex's free will away. He eventually tells Alex that his wife died after being attacked and raped by a gang of thugs. Thugs. Alex feels ill when he's reminded, although it seems to be more of a product of the conditioning than real remorse. He's invited to sleep there, and when he gets up the next morning, he investigates the old man's work in order to find out his name. He ends up reading the novel that the man was writing earlier in the book, A Clockwork Orange. When Alex reads the book, he thinks it sounds like insane ramblings. The book is a commentary on the government's limit of free will. How very meta. Alexander, we'll learn his name from the book, has been making phone calls for Alex and has written an article criticising the experiment and treatment of Alex by the government. This article, while being represented as a way of helping Alex share his story, is just a political weapon to use against the government. Alex and his experiences are once again being used as a tool, but just for the opposing party now. Eventually, Alexander finds out that Alex is the one who raped his wife all those years ago. Ironically, Alex's downfall is in part due to the use of the Nadsat language, which he finds so sophisticated. That, along with his mention of Dim, alerts Alexander to his identity. Alexander enacts revenge the next morning by waking Alex up with classical music. Alex is sickened by the music he's conditioned to react against and begs for it to be stopped. He screams and bangs on the walls until he's bleeding, and in a climactic act of desperation, he jumps out of the apartment window. He awakes in the hospital, still sore and injured, but alive nonetheless. This chapter serves to tie up many loose ends with the side characters. The chaplain leaves the prison and preaches elsewhere, where he can live by his own ethics more freely. Alex is told that the governor will not be re-elected due to the ethics concerning the experiment, and Alex's parents inform him that Joe has moved out and they're ready to welcome him back home. Alex later falls asleep and has violent dreams. However, these dreams aren't accompanied by the usual sickness that has been conditioned into him. He seems to be back to, I guess, normal. This is confirmed when the doctors at the hospital ask him to describe what he would do to objects or figures in pictures. When presented with eggs, he wants to smash them, and when presented with a woman, he wants to rape her. Once again, he does not feel at all at the thought, and this is further confirmation that his disgust at violence was purely conditioned into him, and he didn't experience genuine remorse or repulsion for his actions. The Interior Minister soon visits Alex, hoping to use him in favour of the government again. He convinces Alex that everything the government did was for his own good, and tells him that Alexander has been arrested for threatening to murder Alex. The minister says that the government will provide for Alex when he's out of hospital, and as an initial gift, he brings in a stereo playing Beethoven's Ninth that Alex can now fully enjoy. A document is placed in front of Alex, and he's so enraptured by the music that he signs it without thinking, and he has a final photograph of the minister. The chapter ends with Alex dreaming about violence and commenting that he was indeed cured. You may notice if you've seen the movie that the book is very similar, almost identical if identical, but no. The book has one last chapter that was criticised by Kubrick, amongst others, as too optimistic of an ending. Here's the original ending of the book, and my defence of it. The book's final chapter starts by mirroring the start of the book. Alex has a new band of droogs and sits at a milk bar with them, ready to start their night with some good old violence. When they leave the bar and find a victim to prey upon, Alex simply watches as his droogs assault and rob the man, seemingly taking only a little pleasure in the act, a lot more disinterested. They go to another bar, and when pulling out his wallet to pay for a drink, a picture of a baby drops from it, to the amusement of his droogs. Alex gets angry at their teasing, rips up the picture, and leaves the bar. As he walks, we get an insight into the mind of an older Alex. Violence and classical music no longer excites him the way it used to. He goes into a coffee shop where he sees his old droog, Pete, the quietest one, sitting with a beautiful woman. He finds out the woman is Pete's wife, and Pete seems to have grown into a mature young man. Both him and his wife find Alex's nadsat simply amusing. They talk for a few moments before Pete and his wife leave to go to a party, leaving Alex alone. When Alex goes home from the cafe, he ponders his position in life. He imagines an idealistic domestic life with a wife and a child, although he worries his child might end up like him. Alex finally laments that he's no longer young and talks directly to the reader, vowing to turn his life around, but asking the reader to remember who he once was. On the surface, this may seem optimistic and hopeful, but this left more of a sour taste in my mouth than the movie did, and it adds more depth to Alex's character, in my opinion. I would argue it's sadder for Alex to be forced to yearn for a life he might never have, a life that a peer has achieved despite partaking in the same terrible crimes. The last chapter was so disliked that the US version of the book doesn't even include it. The US editor claimed that it was too bland and showed an unwillingness to, quote, accept that a human being could be a model of regenerable evil. I do not understand that argument. Why does it enhance the book's meaning to show Alex as pure, unredeemable evil? The idea of Alex just being born evil and remaining that way without questioning it is unrealistic. It's uninteresting, and it would render him too basic a subject to properly enforce the message of the book upon. The book works, in my opinion, because of the ultimate realization that evil, despite some factors, is a chosen trait and may be overcome. What's the point in discussing the ethics of a government forcing good upon someone if there's no possible outcome presenting natural good by comparison? The original ending highlights the differences between real and synthesized goodness. Earlier in the novel, Alex wants to commit violence, but biologically cannot due to his illness preventing him from doing so. The ending, however, shows an Alex that has little real desire to commit crime. He's not repulsed by it or conditioned to fear it, he just makes a conscious choice to turn away from it. This reinforces the message that true goodness must come from within to be sustainable, something that the book is trying to show with its argument. Another problem that people have with the ending is how out of character it seems for Alex to want a family. I also disagree with this. For some time has passed between the last two chapters of the book, years in fact, and the picture of a baby in his pocket kind of proves that these thoughts have ruminated for some time. They only fully come into fruition by seeing Alex happy with his family, but they clearly were there. It was something that Alex has been pondering for a while. Lastly, people hail Alex turning his life around as unrealistic. To that point, I present this question. Does he turn his life around? He certainly wants to, but does he have the determination, respect, resources, patience, etc. to do so? The novel never actually alludes to Alex living happily ever after. He regains free will and decides what he wants, but it's ultimately left unsaid whether he achieves happiness or if his past haunts him too much. Maybe in true dystopian fashion, he will come to the horrific realization that while he can control his desires, he has no external control on the world. If we take a look at the alternate ending, that Alex is pure evil, can never be changed and will never be changed, then the question of free will in the book is completely pointless, for ultimately it wouldn't matter what the government imposed. Alex being born evil implies that humans are born with no free will. If this is to be the case, then the message that Burgess intended, the institution's limitations of free will, is completely pointless and redundant. This isn't speculation either. Burgess has repeatedly defended his ending of the book, and has made it clear that the alternate ending takes away from the larger social issues discussed in the novel. Analysing the book as a whole, I have a few things to address. First of all, the title and milk symbolism. The meaning of the title is fairly well discussed at this point, with most people coming to the conclusion that the Clockwork Orange is a rather literal imagery, as something organic and natural, the orange, being mechanised by something man-made and technological, clockwork. This mirrors Alex's natural mind and instincts being interfered with by the researchers. Something less discussed, however, is the milk symbolism in the book. My version of the book, along with many others, has a symbol of a glass of milk on it. The milk is often used as a famous symbol of the book. In the book, the milk is mentioned as a concoction of drugs that Alex and his friends drinks at the milk bar. Looking at it symbolically, however, you could argue that it mirrors the title. Something organic and a usual symbol of nurture and innocence, the milk, is being perverted by drugs, a symbol of hedonism and often associated with crime. The overall themes of the book are, at large, a widely discussed topic: institutions, interference with free will. However, I do find in particular the ethics of synthesized versus natural morality interesting. It may be easy to see the government as evil in this book, but I think of them as more morally grey. Sure, they're uncaring and unnuanced, but as they proclaim in the book, if the treatment works and it'll reduce the rate of crime, it's not a perfect solution, but if you had the key to low crime rates at your disposal, tell me you wouldn't be at least tempted to use them, even if it meant the loss of identity of what they just see as common street thugs. The loss of identity in Alex is further represented when he is accidentally conditioned to be repulsed by classical music. Without either his love of crime or music that didn't hurt anyone, he is completely stripped of his hobbies and identity and becomes a former husk of himself. Perhaps if he'd been listened to by the authority before he was arrested, they may have found that the key to bettering him was something like music therapy, for example. That way he would have kept his identity and sense of self while still staying completely lawful. Throughout the book, we don't really see a lawful version of Alex, as when he's conditioned, he may not be violent, but he's not Alex either. He's just a text subject. Overall, I do like the book. Despite the language, it's rather simple yet thought-provoking and enjoyable. It isn't as memorable to me as the film, however, as the artistry, costume and set design and cinematography that I remember so uniquely in the film just can't translate into book form. As I said, however, I do prefer the original ending of the book. Overall, my general rating is 7 out of 10, although I'm aware I am slightly biased for it because of my love for the movie. As for how disturbing it is, it's really not that emotionally evocative, so it does sort of miss the mark for a disturbing book. The use of Nadsat is clever, and the fact that this use of language leads to Alex's rock bottom is extremely well utilised, not to mention how it stylises the text. However, purely from a disturbing point of view, it doesn't really convey the true horror of the events of the book, and it didn't make me as the reader feel fear, disgust, tragedy, any of those things. This might be different for some people, of course. As mentioned, even in the most disturbing scene where Alex rapes 2 young girls, the Nadsat is just a barrier for me for how truly disturbing that event is. My rating for how disturbing it was overall is 3 out of 10. There are some disturbing scenes and elements, but people really overhype how violent and graphic it is. So that's it for the second book called The Iceberg. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it to the end. This video is a lot longer, but at this point I've committed to summarising the novels I read as descriptively as I think is necessary, even if it means having hours long videos. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you will join me for the next video. Bye for now.